It's the morning of October 21st, 2010. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. We're here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers for the Rutgers program on the governor, the Thomas H. Kane Archive. This morning we're going to talk to Bob Grady. Bob was Governor Kane's communications director from 1983 to 1986. He went on to work in the Bush White House for George H.W. Bush, and then went to California and pursued a career in business and politics there. He currently serves as Governor Christie's chairman of the New Jersey Council of Economic Advisors. Bob, you've migrated out west, but I think you're a native New Jerseyan, is that correct?
I am. I grew up in Livingston, New Jersey, where Tom Kane lived and where Chris Christie grew up. Went to Livingston High School. And my parents lived in Livingston for more than 50 years until they got older. They're now in their mid-80s and live in a retirement community.
Did you know Chris Christie in Livingston?
Oh yeah, we grew up together. His mother was a good friend of my mother's. I've known Chris since he was about 12 or 13 years old.
How old were you when he was 12 or 13?
I was 17. I was the class president of Livingston High School, class of 1975, and Chris was the class president, class of 1981. At the time he became class president, my dad was actually the mayor of Livingston, and so put him on some town committees. Then when I worked for Governor Kane in the State House, Chris came down to Trenton and visited with me. I introduced him around. Then he applied to Seton Hall Law School. My mother was the dean of admissions at Seton Hall Law School at the time, and a friend of his mother's. He was admitted and went. When he was in law school, he came and visited me in the White House when I was working for President Bush Sr. And I took him to lunch in the White House mess, and he met Dick Darman and Jim Baker and Dan Quayle and some other guys. And it was actually from the White House in 1992, when Chris was visiting me, that I called Bill Palatucci, who he had never met, and said, Bill, I have a guy here who'd like to volunteer for the 92 campaign for Bush Quayle in New Jersey. He's a young guy, he's a great guy, he's a law student. Chris Christie, you think, you could use a volunteer. And they met each other, and of course, as time went on, they became law partners and best friends, and Bill was really his campaign manager in a series of campaigns, originally for freeholder, and later, obviously, for governor. And then, and actually, when Chris applied, or his name was mentioned, let's put it that way, for the U.S. Attorney job for New Jersey, I was very friendly then and now with President George W. Bush and his associate Carl Rove, and I called Carl and wrote a letter on behalf of then Chris Christie, now Governor Christie, and obviously he served with great distinction as U.S. Attorney. So we go way back.
When do you think you first got interested in politics and government? In
politics and government? Really from as early as I can remember. I kind of grew up in a political household. I was the youngest of 5 kids. Grew up in the 60s. My parents were very active. Really, it was the Vietnam War that got them active. We were kind of a typical Catholic anti-war family. My parents are an interesting mix of pro-life, anti-capital punishment, and anti-war. The true sort of Catholic pro-life ideology, if you will. Our politics have gotten mixed up since then, but that was at least an internally consistent point of view from a respect for life point of view. And I remember as a kid, lived in a little neighborhood in Livingston, and my best friend, who remains a very, very close friend, Rich O'Meara. And it was very funny because he was interested in different things, camping and Boy Scouts and Army, and I would always, from as early as I can remember reading, I would read the New York Times and the magazines that came into our house, and they would laugh at me because I was in first grade or something, and I would come over to the O'Meara's house, and my friend Dickie would talk about camping, and they would ask me like what was in the paper today, and then they would all fall over laughing as I would describe it. And then I do remember in the 1968 presidential campaign, McCarthy had dropped out by the time New Jersey came along, but our family volunteered for the Robert F. Kennedy campaign, for Bobby Kennedy's campaign in New Jersey. I remember going down to the headquarters and, stuffing envelopes and being on the phone bank, making phone calls. So I would have been 10 years old at that time.
And when did you become a Republican?
Well, I went off to college at Harvard. I was kind of a typical, lefty at Harvard. I was one of the editors of the Harvard Crimson, which was a very liberal paper, let's put it that way. But, in New Jersey in that time, the labels of right and left that apply today, were probably pretty different. So when I was in college, I applied for an internship and got a job and worked for Millicent Fenwick of New Jersey, who was the congresswoman who represented mostly Morris and Somerset County, but also the very western edge of Essex, Livingston and Millburn. And, if you think of it, she was very conservative on taxes and spending, as you would expect, but in those days, one of the big issues was the Equal Rights Amendment. She was a leading proponent. She was the sponsor in the House of Representatives of the Equal Rights Amendment bill. She was obviously a pro-choice politician. She was very, very, very pro-environment. She, very active record on environmental protection. Before the rating agency, if you will, the League of Conservation Voters, got so partisan, in those days they used to give her a 100% rating because she had co-sponsored the bill to protect wilderness in Alaska, the Alaska Lands Bill. She was one of the original co-sponsors of the bill that was carried actually by Jim Florio, who later became governor of New Jersey, creating the Superfund to clean up hazardous waste sites. So she was, very progressive on all those issues. And if you compare that, you think of that choice, that was an era where the Republicans were kind of the moderate, Better Business Bureau for clean government type Republicans. Cliff Case was the kind of spiritual leader of that group in New Jersey. Mrs. Fenwick, who had originally worked for Senator Case in coming up in her career, and Tom Kean really was part of that group of people and that ideology. And if you contrast that to the Democrats in that era, in the 1960s, Joe Minish was the congressman to the neighboring district, and in fact, for a period was my congressman before I could vote, but later there was a redistricting and Mrs. Fenwick had our district. But if you think of Congressman Minish's record, he was a supporter, as was George Meany, then the head of the AFL-CIO, of the Vietnam War. In fact, and Joe had been a AFL-CIO shop steward before he got into politics. He was actually a pro-lifer. He was, really not particularly concerned about the environment because he was very tied into the building trades, the heavy construction unions in New Jersey. So, the labels that today apply for Republican and Democrat and even right and left were probably a little, they revolved around different axes in those days and were a little more blurry.
So was it Millicent Fenwick and that opportunity in her office that caused you to become a Republican?
Pretty much, yeah. And I was very supportive of Mrs. Fenwick. She had run, when I was in high school, well, first of all, when I was in high school, I mentioned I was the class president. My dad was the Democratic mayor of Livingston. He was a two-term councilman, two-term mayor. But I remember Mrs. Fenwick running in 1974 for the House. She first of all ran a primary and beat Tom Kean by 83 votes. But later ran, the Democrat candidate in that year was a fellow named Fred Bowen. And that was the first time I kind of looked at the two people and I thought Mrs. Fenwick was a more effective person and a better candidate. And I remember just making that choice, thinking she was better than Mr. Bowen. I don't even know where he is, so I won't say anything else there. But so I got to know her a little bit, and then as you're right, and then obviously I went to work for her, but then very enthusiastically. I interned for her for the summer between my junior year at Harvard and my senior year at Harvard College, and had a wonderful experience, worked on a number of projects, but bills and amendments, one of which made it all the way to the floor of the House of Representatives, so I got to go on the floor and kind of be her staffer advising her what to say on this small amendment that she was carrying, which had to do with Social Security benefits for Native Americans. It was kind of an obscure topic, but anyway. But I think I did a good enough job on that when I was a senior in college and I had applied and gotten into a number of law schools, I got a call from her then administrative assistant, a fellow named Hollis McLaughlin, who said that their legislative assistant was leaving to go to Stanford Business School, Peggy Allen, which is later where I went to graduate school, and would I be interested in a full-time job when I graduated? So I said yes, and I deferred law school for 2 years. Of course, 2 years went on, and then I was legislative director because President Reagan by that time had won election and One of our guys went downtown to work in the State Department. So, and then, as you know, she decided to run for the United States Senate in 1982 and won a primary against Jeff Bell, and then ran against Frank Lautenberg. And we sent the person who had been our chief of staff in Washington, Larry Rosenshine, to New Jersey to run the campaign. So I became the chief of staff of the Washington office. I was her administrative assistant, is what you'd call that person, when I was about 23 or 24 years old. And so we were kind of the odd couple on Capitol Hill, because at the time Mrs. Fenwick was 72 and I was 23 or 24, and we'd wander around together all the time and be seen in the hallway all the time chatting. And she was, of course, a great person and a great friend.
So you worked for her for 7 years or thereabouts?
No, about 4 years.
About 4 years,
yeah.
Okay.
And until we lost that election in 1982 to Lautenberg.
Uh-huh.
I'll just note for the record that at the time, Frank Lautenberg was 58, Millicent Fenwick was 72, and he ran ads implying not very subtly that Mrs. Fenwick was too old to hold the office and forgetful, etc. And he remains in the United States Senate at the tender age of 86.
So I heard as recently as this week on talk radio, the legend that has come down from that race was that entire race was him saying she was too old. Is that how you remember it?
Well, there were multiple factors. That was one. He clearly made that implication and almost direct allegation. Two, if you remember, 1982 was the off year of the Reagan first term cycle. So President Reagan was elected in a landslide in 1980. And 1982 was, we were at the depths of the recession that was being wrung out of the U.S. economy. Interest rates were very high. Inflation was still pretty high. And that was a big Democrat year in 1982. Longtime incumbent Republican senators almost lost. John Chafee in Rhode Island won by a point. Jack Danforth in Missouri won by a half a point. And several others lost. So it was a big Democratic year. Republicans had lost some of the gains they had made in 1980 in the House and lost some seats in the Senate. I think the core issue that Lautenberg successfully prosecuted, if you will, was that Mrs. Fenwick was too concerned with the world. She was on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and not concerned enough with the New Jersey economy. That it was at the depths of that last recession, and he did a good job of focusing his campaign on the topic of New Jersey jobs, and his slogan was, I remember his tagline in one of his commercials because it was devastating. It said, "Millicent Fenwick for the world, Frank Lautenberg for New Jersey." And then it said, "Frank Lautenberg, New Jersey first." That was his slogan, New Jersey first. And, the last factor, which probably was the most decisive, frankly, was money. And Mrs. Fenwick, really came up in that reform tradition in government. And she did not take PAC money. And she wanted to prove that you could win a U.S. Senate race without taking PAC money. And we raised, what at the time was a staggering amount from individuals, $5 million. Probably had to spend $1 million or $2 million beating Jeff Bell in the primary, another $3 or $4 million for the general. And she ended up proving the opposite. Because, of course, Frank Lautenberg had been very successful, having founded ADP, the payroll company, with his cousin Josh Weston. And he outspent us on television by a ratio of about 12 to 1. And we just couldn't overcome that onslaught. Mrs. Fenwick was ahead by 20 points on Labor Day, by 16 points on October 1st. Our 3-day rolling average overnight polling the night before the election showed her ahead by 7. It was 82 degrees that day in New Jersey, very warm, record turnout, obviously high turnout in the cities, etc., and Lautenberg won by about 30,000 votes out of 3 million cast. Now, the other thing is he did what Democrats did in those days and probably still do, which is he had a lot of street money, walking around money, was later caught and fined for that last weekend for distributing checks, distributing money around over $2 million on that final weekend in street money. And I think he was fined like $50,000 by the Federal Election Commission, and he was a U.S. Senator. I don't think he cared too much about that wrist slapping. But we went on to become friends when I served for the governor, and I've known Senator Lautenberg ever since. So,
when did you first encounter Tom Kean?
Well, he lived in Livingston. He didn't move to where he lives now in Somerset County until after he was governor. So I knew his family. I think I met him when he was a member of the Assembly, and in the 70s when I was in high school. And I wouldn't say I knew him well. But then when in 1981 I was working in Congresswoman Fenwick's office and he was running, and we went up and did some events for him, etc. And then in 1982 we were running for the Senate, as I mentioned, and I was the chief of staff in Washington, and he was the governor in his first year. And we interacted a lot. And after Mrs. Fenwick lost that election, he called me up and said, "Gee, my own view is you're one of the people in Fenwick's operation who's any good." And
He called you personally? Do you
he did.
recall?
He did. The governor did.
Let me go back 1 second. It was a crowded primary for governor in 1981.
Right.
Did Millicent Fenwick support Tom Kean in that primary? Do you recall?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I think she. I don't recall. I do know that after their primary in 1974, it was not the kind of bitter outcome that you might see in an election today. They remained very good, very close friends. They admired each other. And Mrs. Fenwick used to tell the story how at the end of that hotly contested primary, because she won by 83 votes, and the last day when it was all over, they embraced, hugged and kissed and said, best of luck to each other. So they remained friends. But that, as you say, there were 7 or 8 people in that primary, and she may have not endorsed anybody.
All right, let's jump ahead again to Tom Kean calling you on the phone and saying he was interested in recruiting you.
Yes.
For what?
Well, a couple of different things. And I would say not only the governor called me, but certain other of his consultants and others that knew us from the 82 campaign. So John Deardorff also called me, of Bailey Deardorff, who was a
national
political consultant. And I believe Bob Teeter called me. Bob Teeter, the pollster, now passed away.
Again, another national Republican figure.
Very famous figure who later was the pollster for President Reagan, for both President Bush's and others. And they had worked very closely with me on that campaign, on the 82 Fenwick campaign. And Roger Stone, another national political consultant who famously had run Governor Kean's race in 1981, but ran against us in 1982 and was impressed that we had beaten him because he was the guru for Jeff Bell, who Mrs. Fenwick beat in a primary in 1982. But anyway, the governor described his predicament as this. He said he had had a tough first year. He wasn't doing very well in the polling and decided he needed to make change. And I think my reputation at the time was, I had been a newspaper editor in college. I had helped to brief Mrs. Fenwick on a lot of the issues as, her chief of staff that would come up in a debate, and had written a lot of press releases and speeches and things like that. So the governor's view was that he needed help on both overall political strategy, but in particular communications, and that he really had not done a good job in his first year communicating what he was trying to achieve, being focused on that, and really tying policy and communications and politics together, and the other person in the mix, whose name I know will come up in this interview, was Greg Stevens. And a little history there. When Mrs. Fenwick served in Congress, she served on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House. And starting in 1978, sitting next to her on that committee was a congresswoman from Maine, now a U.S. Senator, named Olympia Snowe. And Mrs. Fenwick was senior enough that she had a staffer on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which was me. And Mrs. Snowe was junior enough that she didn't. So I kind of staffed the both of them, and I got to be very friendly with Olympia Snowe, and to this day remain very close. In fact, in her last campaign, she came to San Francisco, and we held a fundraiser for her at our home, and we had dinner with her, and she stayed with us, and she sent us a nice gift for my then newly born son, etc. So, I love Olympia. But anyway, Olympia's chief of staff in those days was Greg Stevens. And Governor Kean had known Greg because Greg had been the press secretary for President Ford's campaign in 1976 in New Jersey. And in the Reagan
Was
Ford,
Greg a New Jerseyan?
Reagan, Ford.
Was Greg a New Jersey?
No, Greg was from Maine. He was from Yarmouth, Maine. And but he had done a very good job. As you recall, in 1976, there was a primary, Gerald Ford against Ronald Reagan for presidency and the Republican side. And Ford carried New Jersey. And Tom Kean, I believe, was the campaign chairman for Ford in New Jersey. And Greg was the press secretary. So they knew each other. And Greg had the same job I had. I had it for Mrs. Fenwick, and he had it for Olympia Snow. And he called Greg, said, I need your help. I need somebody who can pull this thing together, communicate well, etc. And Greg also called me and said, I know he's calling you. What do you think? Should we do this together? And, I at the time was going to go back to law school, and I said, well, gee, it's the governor. Why not? And so we went up together, basically. He started, a month or two before me, but in the beginning of 1983, after Mrs. Fenwick had retired from office, was retired by the voters, I came up to New Jersey and started for Governor Kean.
Where did you settle in New Jersey when you came up?
In Princeton. I lived in a little house at 25 Jefferson Road, about 3 blocks behind Nassau Street, behind PJ's Pancake House. Excellent place to have breakfast, if anyone was listening. That was great. I was only 26 years old, I guess, 26 years old at the time. So I was a single person, live in Princeton. I could go over to the campus every now and then if I had any time, which of course it turned out I didn't, to go hear a lecture. That was my idea, or something like that. And I used to liberally use their basketball courts and things like that to get some exercise. And
so Greg Stevens replaced Lou Thurston as chief of staff after the first year of the Kean administration, and
Correct.
You came in a month or so later, in essence, with Greg Stevens.
Yes.
And your title was Director of Communications right off the bat?
Yes, it was. And we were, I think it's fair to say we were attached at the hip. We were noticed when we arrived as the two new guys. I will say that the governor, early on in that period, pulled both of us, as, we were plotting with the governor how we were going to succeed. And he did pull us both aside and say, you guys, you have my backing. You tell me you can make any changes you want, but we need to change what we're doing here. I think at the time he had about a 38% approval rating. And he said, carte blanche, we need to make change and we need to improve our operation. So if you tell me what we need to do, and we'll do it.
So what'd you do?
Well, we did a number of things. Part of it was just instilling a certain amount of discipline. I think Greg was a very tough, competent manager, but when he said something, he made sure that people did it and listened. I really focused on both the policy of the governor's office and sort of honing it down to a manageable number of issues that people could understand, and communicating that in new ways. I do think Greg and I brought a little bit of a new culture there. I'd come from Capitol Hill. I was a young, ambitious person. And Capitol Hill, people work till midnight every night. That's what they do. They work hard. And I remember coming to Trenton and started doing that. I mean, I think I would leave the office, most nights at 1 or 2 in the morning and sort of burn the midnight oil there. And I remember some of the old State House reporters, Danny Weissman and Star Ledger and others, would come by and at 6 or 7 o'clock, and they'd be amazed we were still there typing and working on tomorrow's speech or tomorrow's plan. And they were like, "What are you doing?" Everybody, half the legislature and the press corps was retiring to Pete Lorenzo's cafe to go have a drink at about that hour, and literally I think people took notice that we were really putting in the hours and working very hard. But 2 different things that we did, one on policy and one on communications. On policy, we had kind of a series of meetings with the governor and really thought about what he was trying to achieve. And we looked at polling about what the people in the state were concerned about. We listened to his conviction on certain issues. And we kind of decided that we really needed to focus on a series of priorities. And over time, that developed into really 3 areas that we thought should drive all of our activities. Should drive the budget, should drive what we were trying to achieve communications-wise, should be what he stood for.
Let me guess. 3 E's.
Exactly. We decided, first of all, the number one thing, as it is today, would be to improve the state's economy. And so we tried to look at proposals for things we might do through that lens. What could we do to create jobs? Secondly, the state is well known to have a long-standing concern about environmental protection, environmental conditions, and it was our view that people really were going to remain concerned about that. And if you remember, this was the early 1980s. President Reagan, I obviously believe was a great president, but on the issues of environmental protection, he probably was a little bit out of sync with the people of New Jersey. He had an EPA administrator named Ann Burford who basically did a lousy job when she came in. He had a person named Rita Lavelle in charge of the hazardous waste, newly created Superfund program, who probably didn't execute the mission as well as she might have. And so we had a view that that was unacceptable. First of all, it was an area where the governor was willing and able to break with the president. But secondly, if the federal government wasn't going to do the job, we were going to take action on the state level. And so we came up with a number of initiatives to create our own Superfund in New Jersey, a state-level Superfund, and to do a whole number of other things. Frankly, there was some concern at the time. We were beginning to have more than had been in the past in the public consciousness worry about ocean pollution and the character of the water on the New Jersey shore. And when we analyzed, I actually spent a lot of time analyzing that problem and visiting with people at the shore. And part of the conclusion was that it was certain of the activities of the city and state of New York were contributing to our problem. So we litigated against them to close the Fresh Kills landfill up in Staten Island, which was causing things to wash up on our beaches. We also litigated against the federal EPA to get them to close what was then called the 106-mile site where sewage sludge from sewage treatment plants was just dumped in the ocean off the Atlantic City coast. And then there was a longer-term battle where some New Jersey politicians were on the other side of this one, including Frank Lautenberg, ironically, to get the Port Authority basically to stop dredging New York Harbor and dumping the dredge spoils right off of Monmouth County, 6 miles offshore, because there were heavy metals, cadmium, mercury, et cetera, in those silts. And anyway, the third issue, and one, if you remember, Tom Kane was a graduate of Columbia Teachers College. He's always had a real interest in education. And right around that time, I guess it didn't really come out till the next year, but the governor was already obviously a member of the National Governors Association, a member of the Education Commission of the States, which he later chaired. And at the time, you had other governors like Jim Hunt, Democrat in North Carolina, Lamar Alexander, Republican in Tennessee, making some waves in education reform. And in the middle of that, there was a report, didn't come out till 1984, that famously said that America's public schools were plagued by what it called a rising tide of mediocrity, and that if we didn't reform the schools, we were really going to be headed for trouble. It was 1984, 26 years ago, and a lot of the points they made still apply. But the governor really shepherded the policy development on that out of his own knowledge and conviction. But Greg and I worked a lot with Greg and the late Carrie Edwards, on a strategy for getting a package of reforms through the legislature, and what those reforms would be, what we would say about them, and then how to win. And if you recall, in 1984, we were able to pass a very, very significant 3-part package, still resonates in terms of its desirability and effectiveness. One was to have merit pay for teachers, to say that a teacher who really was judged by their peers, that was an accommodation to the concerns of the NJEA and the teachers unions, judged by their peers to be a superior teacher, was eligible to get a $5,000 bonus for being a better teacher. 2, that we would increase the minimum starting salary for teachers in New Jersey from $13,500 to $18,500. And that's a whole topic we can get into. The NJEA opposed that proposal, which I, at the time, found to be amazing. And then thirdly, we created a program in alternative certification. So a person who is a subject matter expert, if they could pass a subject matter test and then teach successfully as a student teacher for a year, could then be certified as a teacher in the New Jersey public school system, even though they didn't major in education, and get their teaching certificate through the normal route. So anyway, those were the 3 big topic areas. And I can talk ad nauseum about this, but from then on, really, from around the middle of 1983 or so, when we really decided these were going to be it, they really drove our policymaking and our communication. So in the budget, we did our best, frankly, to hold everything else in the budget flat. Literally flat in nominal terms, precisely so we could have massive increases in the three things we were trying to communicate were priorities: education, environmental protection, job creation. And then as we focused on those priorities, then there was a whole sort of policy development apparatus that grew up around trying to think of what we could do. And really the most of the year, 1984, as I recall it, was spent developing some proposals in conjunction with investment bankers and lawyers and our own staff, first on the job creation front around the creation of the Transportation Trust Fund, which was originally intended to be a revolving loan fund so that we could basically make maximum use of those federal grants we got from the Federal Highway Administration, from the U.S. DOT, to build highways. And we did do that. We securitized those proceeds and were able to kind of recycle them. But it enabled something else, which, in addition to being the right thing to do, was politically very valuable, which was that it enabled us to just complete a number of projects that had just been kind of delayed for too long. And so if you think, big issue in southern New Jersey is economic development, especially in Cumberland County and in the Gloucester County and the inland parts. And we were able to complete Route 55, which had been kind of on the drawing boards for 20 or plus years. And it was a huge concern to people, Senator Hurley and others from down there. And it was a big deal that we cut the ribbon, we built the road, and then we broke the ground, and then we built the road, and then we had a ribbon cutting. And then same thing, Route 24 in Morris County, which, as you know, takes you sort of from the Newark Airport area out to 287 in the western Morris County areas much more quickly than surface routes. And again, that had been fought over and battled. And Dean Gallo and many others had tried to get it built, and there were fights over exact routing through Melbourne and Mendham and Morristown, some nice neighborhoods. People fought it. But I think over time, the traffic was such that people really thought it ought to be built, and we got the funding and kind of pulled the parties together, came up with an acceptable route, got it built. And I think those were very popular initiatives, both in specific regions of the state and a whole other topic. I'm rambling, I recognize, but very popular because we were still coming out of that '82 recession. And we did put the building trades to work. We did put the heavy construction unions to work. And Governor Kane had a terrific alliance with those operating engineers and the heavy construction unions. And as a result, many of them endorsed his reelection in 1985, as you will recall. And what he later became famous for, the politics of inclusion, started with really some of the outcomes in that 1985 race, where we were able to secure 62% of the vote, according to the crosstabs and the exit polling after the election, of union households. And we were able to secure 68% of the votes of African American households, which were unheard of numbers for Republicans, both then and since.
To what extent was all of this enabled by economic recovery nationally?
It's impossible to kind of sort out the attribution and diagram that sentence, if you will. But obviously, it helped to have a rising tide in the country. But New Jersey, we had a lot of data on this. New Jersey's job growth was faster than other regions. We took a lot of steps to try to make New Jersey more attractive to businesses. We took a lot of steps to try to. This is a whole other topic which we can get into when we turn to communications. To make people proud to be from New Jersey. I mean, the governor was very conscious of a feeling that New Jerseyans felt they kind of were mistreated by New York to the north, Philadelphia to the south, that we hadn't gotten our due, we didn't have our own VHF television station, just New Jersey there's a long history, which again is a policy matter which we can go into, of New Jersey in those days, in the 70s and 80s, being a net importer of garbage from New York. People felt dumped on, literally. And And the governor said, no, wait a minute. We have a lot to be proud of in New Jersey. We're one of the we are the most highly educated by very many measures states in the country. We're a high-income state, actually, second only to Connecticut. And he said, we want to be a high-growth state. So the governor, like Governor Christie is doing now, actually spent a lot of effort trying to convince companies to locate their headquarters here, foreign companies to locate manufacturing here, and so on and so forth. And it was pretty successful. We opened a number of headquarters over those years. And we had a very active commerce department, which I guess doesn't exist anymore, Board and Putnam led, and we had a whole kind of business recruitment effort that was part of the job creation thing.
You came in at age 25, 26 to be Director of Communications. How did you get along with Carl Golden, a sharp personality with a lot of State House experience, a lot of experience with Tom Kean,
right?
And by virtue of his title, press secretary, nominally in charge of another aspect of communication.
Right. I'd say, over time we became and remained friends. I would say there was probably some tension early on in those days. I think I was viewed as a young, ambitious, sort of, up-and-comer, and that's not always welcomed. But we had different jobs. The governor did a good job sorting out who had what role. Carl's job was really the traditional press secretary job. I did not, on Tuesday we signed a bill to, improve disability benefits. I wasn't the person who put out the press release that said we signed that bill, or who, importantly, I wasn't the one who took the phone calls from New Jersey Network or the Star Ledger or anybody else and gave them a comment on that bill. I did not do the day-to-day comment with the press. That was the press secretary's job. That was Carl's job. What I did was the forward planning, the sort of proactive, what are we going to communicate? What are we going to do for the next month? What are we going to do? What initiatives are we going to pursue over these next 2 months, and what events will we have associated with that? And so it was, trying to focus things on the 3 E's. I actually worked much more closely than somebody like Carl might have with all the departments in the preparation of the budget. One of the things I did in my time at the State House, I wrote 3, maybe 4 budget messages to the New Jersey legislature and 4 State of the States. And that was a gigantic project every winter.
Were you the chief speechwriter as communications director?
I absolutely was. I wrote the overwhelming majority of the governor's speeches in that era. So I was writing the speeches. I would probably draft the press releases, but I wasn't dealing with the press on a day-to-day basis. There was probably a little tension here and there. I remember at one point, Jim Goodman of the old Trenton Times wanted to do a big front-page profile. This is, by this time, 1985, as we were getting in the middle of the re-election campaign, and our fortunes had turned around quite a bit. Governor's polling numbers were quite positive. And, in retrospect, I guess it was obvious he was going to be re-elected, but he was the favorite in that race. And Jim was going to do a big profile on me and Craig Stevens as the 2 guys who had turned the governor around and had some success in advising him. And Carl really went ballistic on that and thought it was inappropriate and unfortunate, and worked such that it turned into a profile, which I still have a copy of somewhere in my study, of the governor's top aides. So it turned into a profile of Greg and myself and him and Carrie Edwards and Ed McGlynn, who also was a little bit ballistic about that profile, and Gary Stein. So it was, or Ken Marin, I can't remember. Ken Marin, I guess, at the time. Gary had already gone to the Supreme Court, and it was the 6 of us that were featured in this profile. But, it is what it is. It was all fine. But, I think an important part of all this, maybe you're going to ask about it, but maybe I'll just volunteer some thoughts, because I started to say, I really had 2 jobs. The policy, which I mentioned, we tried to focus on 3 issues, worked on the budget, had that inform our selection of events, our funding, everything we did. The other part was communications. And if you think of the governor, my analysis was the governor's first year in 1982, he was on the defensive for much of that year. He did not have what I would call a proactive strategy for communications. He was criticized because he got backed into signing a tax increase. He slipped in the bathtub and injured his back in the summer of 1982 and had a month where he felt physically awkward, and all the stories were about his injury. It just was kind of nothing, Debbie Kane explained, as you recall, that she didn't want to move into Drumthwacket because she really didn't like it, and famously was quoted saying she didn't like the furniture because the tables and the chairs had claws on their feet. And that quote became symbolic of a lot of things. But all of it was defensive. I think the governor found himself reacting to the press corps in the State House in particular, a long-standing complaint of Republicans that were probably more biased to the Democrats instead of to the Republicans. And how could we just communicate more effectively and have them write about the stories we were trying to promote and the topics we thought were important to the state instead of just being reactive all the time. And so a big part of my job was to devise strategies to just communicate more effectively directly with the people of the state. So one of the things we did, we first of all, we launched a program of really trying to focus our communications initiatives around those three issue areas I talked about. Secondly, we just kind of made a decision. If we're going to sign a bill related to one of those topics, we're not going to sign it in the State House. If it's a bill about Jersey Shore protection, we're going to sign it on the beach in Monmouth County or Ocean County. If it's a bill about schools, we're going to sign it in a school with the press, wherever it is, in Newark or Bergen County or whatever. If we're going to do an economic thing, it's going to be on site, and that way, first of all, we'd get more television people there, so it would be visually more interesting. But secondly, we might get the regional press and not just the State House press corps. We might have the people who covered Cumberland County or Morris County or Bergen County instead of the guy sitting in the State House bureau. And it was just good to get out and about and be in the state. Thirdly, we decided that one way to communicate directly, and also it would be useful as communicating that the governor was the governor of all the people, et cetera, was we decided to launch a series of town meetings. And we had a long negotiation with one of your colleagues at the time, Drix Neiman. We thought these were newsworthy and they should be covered by the New Jersey Network. He didn't initially think that, so we kind of fought about that. I think they ended up being covered. We had a just public town meeting, open mic, where the governor would go to an auditorium, and we did one in each of New Jersey's 21 counties over the course of a year or two, and on live television. And the governor might make a 1-minute opening statement or something, but other than that, it was open mic. And we literally didn't try to fill the audience with our people or anything else. It was just the governor's going to be in Millville on Tuesday night, October 18th. Please come and ask your questions. And he would stand up there, and Governor Kane, like Governor Christie actually, was very good on his feet, very knowledgeable about policy, having been a member of the Assembly, and very much able to take all questions and answer them coherently and well. And so that was, I think, a good initiative. Then, as we got to thinking about that, we decided, well, we ought to do the same thing with radio. So we got to know the Peter and Eleanor Strauss. Peter was later an ambassador under President Clinton, and I think had been something for Carter. He was a Democrat, but I knew his daughter Jeannie, and was married at the time to Dick Toffel, who'd been my college classmate, fellow Harvard newspaper editor. And we got WMCA to host a radio call-in show. And just, again, we'd go on the air.
MCA was a New York City radio station.
560 in New York. But they had big, transmitting capabilities, so they had coverage statewide. Over time, that evolved in the Governor Kane's second term and later to something that multiple radio stations picked up. And now I think Governor Christie does something similar on 101.5 on the FM side. But at the time, it was not really done. And in fact, Mario Cuomo and Koch both later started doing it in New York, and they said they learned it from us. But Governor would go on for an hour, I think it was once a month, and just take calls from listeners. And again, just answer the questions. No planted questions, no anything, just what people's mind. Then another initiative. The time, think of it, cable television was early in those days. I mean, very low cable. Nationally, cable penetration was 13% when I took over as communications director. And it was my job, so I researched this quite a bit. New Jersey, with no VHS station of its own in and being dependent on New York and Philadelphia stations, which we felt underattended to New Jersey news, And a lot of subscribers, I think, did too. New Jersey had 63% cable penetration. People were signing up in droves to the old suburban Cablevision up in northern New Jersey, and UA, Columbia, et cetera. And so we did a number of things around that. We contracted with the Asbury Park Press to rent their studios, and we concocted a cable television show that we put on once a month that I basically produced. And we rented a studio, but we would have a different guest on every month, and it might be a New Jersey author. A lot of times when we couldn't find anybody, it would be somebody from our own cabinet to talk about what was going on in transportation or what was going on in education or whatever. And the governor would interview them. Like, he would be the Charlie Rose or the Dick Cavett of that day, and just interview that person and ask them what they were.
Do you remember what
working
that
on.
was called?
I don't. I think our radio show was called Ask the Governor. I can't remember. I don't remember what it was called, but it was carried statewide, and cable didn't get a giant share, but a couple percent of the people watched it. Then we did something really.
Keep going.
We also started. We used whatever means we had also to do some advertising, and we did two different things. One of which probably later became a little controversial, but it was a signature thing for the governor. But the first one we did is in the 1983 cycle, after I'd gotten there, we worked with our state committee, and we hired actually John Deardorff and Doug Bailey and Bob Teeter, and we produced television ads on behalf of the Republicans who were running for Assembly and Senate that year, and we went on the air with the governor as the spokesman. The governor was, even in that one-year turnaround, 1983, starting to become very popular, so they were happy to have his endorsement. And we bought time on the air in a number of parts of the state. And that was a very successful initiative, and paid for by the state committee, by the Republican Party. And but one of the things we did, and this is part of the research I mentioned, to stretch our dollars further, is that we bought a tremendous amount of time on cable television with those ads, which was very, very, I don't think anybody in politics had ever done it before, ever, in any state. First of all, no state had anything approaching our penetration in cable television. Second of all, it was so much more cost effective. I remember to this day that in those days, a 30-second spot on WCBS TV in New York, depending on time of day, would cost either $10,000 or $15,000. And you would do the analysis. Now, sort of 25 out of every 30 people who saw the spot didn't even live in New Jersey. They lived in Connecticut or New York. Second of all, if you got it to likely voters, it was kind of 1 in 38 people who mattered, I think was the math we came up with. And you're spending $10,000 a throw on WCBS TV. In those days, even though I remember to this day, suburban Cablevision had 1 million subscribers in the Essex County suburbs where I grew up there. Right to the north of us, I think, was UA Cablevision, which still, I guess, has that franchise. They're still fighting up there right now, Cablevision. They had like 1.5 million subscribers to the north in Bergen. And on suburban Cablevision, with 1 million subs, a 30-second spot on CNN, which was a kind of newfangled thing, but political people were watching it, was $90. 30-second spot on ESPN was $90. So we just deduced that was an extremely cost-effective way of reaching, voters, reaching people that we wanted to talk to, and we started advertising on cable television.
Keep going.
Of course, as time went on, then I was involved in 2 other pieces of the communications enterprise. First of all that proactive communications worked. I mean, it helped improve the governor's image, et cetera. But anyway, then one of the things that we were very conscious of was the issue of New Jersey pride that I mentioned, that the state had a lot of assets to be proud of, and that we hadn't sold them well to the rest of the country, et cetera. And so we had a whole tourism department with a tourism budget, and we decided, geez, we should make better use of that. We should have ads on television saying vacation in New Jersey. And so we created a series of advertisements where we got famous New Jerseyans and people who liked New Jersey to make ads with us. And obviously then we had the brilliant idea of having the governor be the spokesman as well as part of that series of commercials. And so we filmed one not far from here down the road in Princeton with Brooke Shields touting New Jersey benefits. At the time she was a Princeton undergraduate. I thought it was a great thing. I was a 25-year-old guy. I got to meet Brooke Shields and make a TV commercial with her. That didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. But Bill Cosby cut a spot for us. Some other people. But the tagline that of an advertising agency, Ketchum, came up with was, and I'll say it the way Governor Kane said it, New Jersey and you, perfect together.
Who came up with it?
An ad agency that was hired by the New Jersey Department of Travel and Tourism.
And the name was of the ad agency?
I think it was Ketchum, which is now
a Jersey-based ad agency. Do you recall?
They had a big presence in New Jersey. I certainly recall going to Manhattan to their offices to have a pitch there. So some of the people who worked on our account were in New York as well. And anyway, they came up with that slogan, and we had bumpers. And as is normal part of the travel and tourism promotion, we had bumper stickers, we had brochures, we had billboards, etc. But New Jersey, like many other states, advertised on appropriate regional and even national television. In New Jersey's case, we didn't bother advertising in California or Alaska or something, but we advertised kind of up and down the East Coast saying, when you're planning your summer vacation, consider the New Jersey shore. And we'd have Bill Cosby saying something nice about New Jersey, and then we'd have Governor Kane walking up the beach saying, please come to New Jersey and you, perfect together. And I think that became sort of a signature moment for him, or something that was very much identified with the governor's personality.
Democrats resented it because they thought it was the governor promoting himself on the taxpayer dime, the tourism budget. What's your response, either at the time or now?
I think I would observe that a number of governors of both parties in various states have done the same thing, number one. Number two, we did, actually, before we did the ads, we did a series of polls that who's the best known spokesman for New Jersey? And Governor Kane was first on that list. Perhaps not surprising, he was the governor. But, and there was no political content at all, of course, to the ads. It was simply, we have mountains, we have beaches, we have wonderful universities like Rutgers. You should come to New Jersey. So I think, and obviously when they saw that, they were very attractive ads, the governor looked great, it was a nice message. I think they were jealous, obviously, of course. Anyway, and then of course we went on to the 1985 time frame, and even though you're working in the governor's office, you're involved in helping the people over on the campaign figure out what they should say in television ads, et cetera, because they're about policy at the end of the day. And so, obviously we did a lot of television advertising in conjunction with the governor's 1985 reelection.
Let me stop you for a second.
Yeah.
What's your assessment of Tom Kane at that time as a communicator?
Well, I think he was good, and he got a lot better.
When?
He was already good. He was a student of it. When I came along, it was better, I would say, frankly, than Millicent Fenwick was. But he really became a student of it and realized if he was going to succeed as governor, he needed to be good at communicating, and he worked at it.
How?
So, a million ways. He read books about speech making and speech writing and speech giving. He retained a consultant who had written one of those books named Jamie Humes, who had been a advisor many years prior to President Eisenhower. And he would keep both quotes on speech tips and, speech tips, books about speech tips, but also some books of quotations and things like that in his home, in his study up in Livingston. As the years went on, over many years, we would, if it was an important speech, I'd find him, we'd collaborate, talk about what he wanted to say, but he would often draft, and this is unusual for most politicians, I can tell you, he'd, in longhand on a yellow pad, make a long draft, and then I'd get it and try to maybe punch it up with some sound bites and applause lines and things like that, but we'd go back and forth, and I'd meet with him for hours on end in his study up in Livingston, working on key speeches as they came up. He was a student of history, and he loved to look at other people's speeches and see what they had done. And I think partly because of the influence of Jamie Humes and partly because of his own study of the craft, one of the people he really liked and took lessons from was Winston Churchill. Articulate and obviously inspirational speech giver. But he had books and books up in his study about Churchill with quotes from Churchill's speeches and copies of those actual speeches.
He had a New England boarding school accent. How is it that in this state of every men and every women, there was not some disconnect between the way his manner of speech and the voting public?
Well, you know, that's one of Governor Kane's gifts. He didn't hide that he was, if you will, a preppy, you know, that he was brought, he went to St. Mark's School in Southborough, Mass, and Princeton, obviously. You know, was fortunate to come from privilege as a child. He didn't hide that, but he had the common touch, too. He was just a very gifted political person. He wasn't haughty in any way. He'd go into a room and Tom Kane would talk to everybody, and he'd go into the kitchen and ask the people how they were doing, and he'd ask the people on the street how they were doing. When it came time to campaign in 1985, he did what Republicans hadn't done before, which is we went and campaigned, and you know, he spoke at the pulpit in black churches. He walked the streets in Newark and Camden and Patterson and other cities in this state, and was absolutely unafraid to do so. And so it's interesting. Even though everyone recognized, if you will, that he had a patrician upbringing, they also recognized that he was a man of the people. One of my favorite incidents, and it showed the touch, it was just hilarious, but at some point along the way there in the early 80s, we did an event in the governor's office on sports or something, and we invited Joe Frazier, the boxer from Philadelphia. Smoking Joe Frazier, beaten Muhammad Ali, as people probably remember, the first person ever to do so, March 8th, 1971 at Madison Square Garden. But this is the early 80s. We have an event. Joe Frazier comes in to the governor's office, and we had the press assembled, and he was a little late, but we decided to kind of begin the event anyway, and the governor was behind the podium. We're kind of waiting for Joe Frazier's arrival. And a few minutes late, Joe Frazier came in, smoking Joe Frazier. He says, "Look, it's the gap-toothed governor." Because the governor did have a little guy. And everybody laughed, but I mean, they were friends. You know, the governor had a certain, whatever it was, he had a great touch and a certain affiliation with every man, if you will. And I don't think, in a way that it did Mrs. Fenwick, my prior boss, I don't think that patrician upbringing hurt him ever, and I don't think it was ever successfully used against him by any of his political opponents. I will say, in that 82 Senate race I mentioned, for example, I think Mrs. Fenwick, Senator Lautenberg, candidate Lautenberg, successfully positioned Mrs. Fenwick as a kind of elitist or someone from Bernardsville and Somerset County, and kind of implied those people were a little bit out of touch with the concerns of the everyday person. That charge was never made and never really was able to stick when it came to Tom Kane.
How did Governor King get along with the press?
I think he got along with the press better than most politicians do. You know, there's an old saying, you don't get in a fight with people who print ink by the barrel. Of course, that was before computers and television and whatever, but the point still applies. I mean, many politicians of both parties frustrated with their coverage and, you know, tendency to want to fight. I think the governor realized that you know, the press was an essential instrument of communicating what he was trying to do, and that people were just doing their jobs and they needed to report and he needed to communicate, and you might as well help them do their jobs and it'll help you do your job. So I think he actually understood the role of the press well and didn't unduly get in fights with them. I think, like any governor, there might be times when someone wrote a story that he didn't think was accurate, and they might, you know, he might be less inclined to talk to that reporter afterwards or something like that. But he wasn't legendarily vindictive in any way that I can recall. In fact, and he was smart enough to recognize that here in New Jersey anyway, you know, one newspaper that certainly has outsized influence probably, the Star-Ledger, used to be called the Newark Star-Ledger, and you know, and I think he went out of his way to cultivate the Ledger and to cultivate a relationship with a fellow who used to be the editor, Mort Pye, and his various reporters. Did he?
Yes, the governor.
Yes, I'm sure they chatted periodically, but the governor periodically would go in there for editorial boards, and I would even say this is a paper that was dominant in the state, so there were certain times, if we had a big story and we wanted to make sure it got big play, we might choose to put it out to them before to the other papers. And
Feed the ledger, we call it. In
feed the
press.
ledger, exactly. We might leak it to the ledger on purpose to get maximum play. And the governor was very sophisticated in his knowledge of the press, and therefore I think it helped his success a lot.
What you described earlier was essentially a righting of the ship, or a slight redirection of the ship and righting of the ship. And then came the 1985 re-election year.
Right.
Did you know ahead of time it was going to be as successful as it turned out to be?
I don't think we knew. I mean, obviously, you want to, and we had we used to talk about this. You know, you play as hard as you can on every play, and you play like you're going to lose. And having come through an election with Millicent Fenwick in 1982, where we were ahead by 20 points and ended up losing narrowly, and Governor Kane having come through an election in 1981 when he was elected by 1,000 votes, I think the whole organization from top to bottom was filled with the conviction that you never know and you need to work as hard as you can every day to make sure you're going to have a good outcome. And that's what we did. But it was amazing, the polling numbers, that, you know, how things transpired. First of all, we were helped by a recovery in the national economy. We were helped by a recovery in the New Jersey economy that actually exceeded the national recovery. We had a higher rate of job creation, et cetera. But one number sticks in my head is that, you know, when I came up there and when the governor had a rough first year, and Greg Stevens and I came up, I remember his approval rate was at 38%, sort of toward the end of 1982 there. 38 approve, and the 50 disapprove. And in the spring of 1985, as we were kind of gearing up for the re-elect, at one point in one poll, his approval rating hit 91%. It was 91 to 5. I believe it was the highest ever measured by any governor at the time, probably since. And it was just that the state was firing on all cylinders. Job creation was proceeding. The state was feeling pride. He was communicating successfully on the initiatives that I talked about, and we were getting them done. We did pass education reform in the legislature after a tough fight with the NJEA. We did, and they ended up endorsing the governor once they realized they probably were unlikely to beat him. We did get our Transportation Trust Fund enacted, again, after horse trading and trying to get those last one or two votes. It was very close. We did get the Environmental Trust Fund. That was, frankly, less controversial. We did get a whole series of things enacted. And then he did things that broadened the base a bit. One famous incident that I was kind of deeply involved in related to, at the time, the apartheid government of South Africa. And when I was at Harvard, as I mentioned, I'd been a student leader in the movement there to try to convince Harvard University to divest its endowment portfolio of stocks that were doing business, of companies that were doing business in South Africa, and also of banks that were making direct loans to the South African government. And frankly, we had some success. We got the bank loans ended. We never got the Harvard portfolio to divest. And some of those people that I knew then actually were then going to graduate school at Princeton, and there grew up a movement, really started on the Princeton University campus, but became a statewide movement to convince first Princeton, but then later New Jersey, the state, to divest its portfolio, which I believe at the time was $9 billion. Today it's $68 billion in the pension system, of stocks of companies doing business in South Africa. And a bill carried by Alan Karcher, then the Speaker of the House of the New Jersey Assembly, passed. It came to the governor's.
Spearheaded by Willie Brown, an African-American assemblyman from Newark.
From Newark. But Alan, Alan was very involved in its passage. He was Speaker, so one would expect that. Bill came to the governor's desk. We had a first meeting of the senior staff, 4 people around the table, including Carrie Edwards, Greg Stevens, the other people I mentioned, said, you should veto this bill. Bad for business. Johnson & Johnson, Jim Burke, I remember at the time, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, had been in touch with the governor. This is a disaster. You're going to make New Jersey not a business-friendly state. You've got to veto it. And I said, you should sign this bill. And I would say, in an ironic way, that case for signing was helped by the actions of the old South African government, the white regime, which in retrospect was in its dying days, they kept imprisoning, Nelson Mandela was still in prison at the time, but they were imprisoning other ANC leaders. You know, every month or so there'd be an incident in the newspaper where they'd have fire hosed a bunch of demonstrators or killed somebody. It was really, you know, quite bad behavior by the South African government. And I do remember one time, and I, you know, like I said, we used to work till late in the evening, and the governor in that meeting expressed to me the concern. He said, well, look, you know, aren't the American companies a force for good in South Africa? Their practices are better than other companies, certainly than the South African companies. And, you know, they're the ones who, for example, are allowing unionization of the workers and this and that. And in part in response to that question, one night, I actually wrote from New Jersey, the head of COSATU, which is the Coalition of South African Trade Unions. And they wrote back to me and said, we want you to know we endorse divestment. We're at the point where we just, that's the right thing to do. We need to put the pressure on this government. And I think that was persuasive to the governor when he saw that letter coming back. And I remember sitting in my office one night, very late, 9 or 10 at night, and the governor knocked on the door, and the governor comes in, says, I've decided I'm going to sign the bill. And I want you to write the strongest statement you can write. And we did. We did sign it. We announced we were going to sign it, and then we later had a ceremony to sign it. The announcement that we were going to sign it, you know, it was front page news. We made the front page of the New York Times and of every newspaper around the country. I still remember the next Sunday, the Weekend Review, Section 4 of the New York Times. South Africa by that point, this is early 1985, I believe, had become a top national issue, and they had, you know, quotes from 5 people on the topic. There was, or maybe 4, it was President Reagan, the then president of South Africa, one of the ANC leaders, and Tom Kean. Those are the people whose pictures with their 4 quotes, and it talked obviously about our bill signing, but just about developments in the country. So we did sign the bill. And what's interesting about that signature, I mean, the way that the governor said it and we framed it was, look, there are times in history where the oppression is so bad you just have to declare which side of the line on which you stand. You just have to say whose side you're on. And in that case, we stood for the freedom and for human dignity and human rights and for allowing a democracy to evolve and flourish as it did peacefully in South Africa. But I think what was interesting, we really did not, I don't ever recall even discussing the topic of politics with the governor on that. We talked about it as a moment in history where you are called to the line and you have to state your position and state which side you're on. And we did. But what I later understood is that that issue, being on the correct side, if you will, being for the end of oppression in South Africa, was kind of a sine qua non for African American voters in New Jersey and probably in the state, in the country. I mean, in other words, it wouldn't have mattered if you were Tom Kean and you had a terrific record on civil rights and you had passed, as we did, an urban enterprise zone bill in New Jersey. If you weren't, you know, willing to support pressure on the South African government, support divestment, you wouldn't have been heard. Your case wouldn't have been heard. We did sign it, and I think even though the governor was a Republican and famously, you know, in our politics in this country for many, many decades, you know, obviously African American voters have tended to vote Democratic in overwhelming majorities. His case was heard, and of course we did win, you know, 2/3 of the black vote in this state. Now, we also did because the governor did a whole number of other things. We campaigned in the black churches. We put ads on black radio in New Jersey, targeted ads. And he had a series of policies, and the governor later, after his reelection, when his reelection was analyzed and dissected by think tanks and everybody from the Heritage Foundation to the Eagleton Institute, we made the point, which I think was good, was that the governor, the real reason for his success in African American communities was that the issues that he chose were coalition building, not coalition splitting issues that he chose to emphasize, and they were of equal concern to conservative white families and more progressive African American families and everybody in between. So what did we, if you looked at his program, when he went into those black churches, what did he talk about? He talked about a thing that we came up with, we called it Safe Streets, where we put police, we radically increased the number of just uniformed police officers on the street corners of the top 10 highest crime cities in the state. Maybe it was 12 highest crime cities in the state. And the state basically subsidized the pay of local police officers so there would be more police presence in the neighborhoods. Now, that's an anti-crime initiative that any right-winger could love, but it also was extraordinarily popular in urban communities and in the African American community. Why? Well, if you live in an urban community, you're also the highest probability to be the victim of crime. Black families were disproportionately the victims of crime. So it was attractive to both right and left. Same thing. We focused on job creation in the inner city. It's since then become a more complicated program. At the time, we had a simple concept originally pioneered by Jack Kemp. Who was the late, very conservative congressman from New York and later presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate. But the concept of urban enterprise zones, where we said, look, if you're willing to locate a business in this most distressed area of city X, we'll give you a tax break. No sales tax, and I think it was, your employees pay half the income tax or something like that. And again, opportunity conservatism, that tax breaks to create incentives that again would be embraced by the right, very consistent with the kind of anti-tax free market ideology of the conservative movement in this country, but also enormously attractive to people who lived in urban areas and to African American communities who were worried, as they should be, about job creation in their communities. So it was a marriage of those interests and of what works. And the governor, it was noted, frankly, that we were very successful, obviously, in our '85 re-election. And he went on and made a series of speeches afterwards, and he wrote a book. Steve Provo, my successor that I recruited to be a speechwriter for Governor Kane, helped him ghostwrite, I would say, The Politics of Inclusion. And in that book, he made the same point, that he didn't succeed among African American families or labor families or whatever by pandering to what he might have thought of as their narrow interests, or by picking some select set of narrow issues and playing that card. He succeeded in those communities by picking issues that were of equal concern to African American families and white families and Hispanic families, to young and old, et cetera, that were fundamentally coalition building issues, and still attacking them with an overall conservative philosophy, Republican ideology, if you will, but recognizing one of the reasons he endorsed some of these policy proposals is that they work, and that they would work equally well in the cities, perhaps better than some of the proposals offered by Democrats over the years.
5 Democrats ran for the nomination to run against him.
Right.
I remember them all because I profiled them one after another, night after night that year. Peter Shapiro, John Russo, Ken Gibson, Bob Del Tufo, and Stephen Wiley.
Right.
Did the strongest one win the primary?
Yes. People forget. Peter Shapiro was the darling of the Democratic Party in New Jersey. He was, I know because I grew up in Livingston, he was a very, very successful Essex County executive, very successful, very smart, seen as a real up-and-comer in the Democratic Party. I knew him multiple ways because he also was a Harvard graduate and a former managing editor of the Harvard Crimson, which is the...
Older than you?
Older than me. He's 5 years old. He was class of '74 at Harvard. Might even be older than that. He might have been... Anyway, he's somewhere between 5 and 10 years older than me. I was class of 1979 at Harvard. But Peter's little sister, Pooh Shapiro, Margaret A. Shapiro, now a reporter, has been for many years for the Washington Post, was the managing editor of the Crimson when I first joined. She was class of '77. So I knew Peter. My dad was a Democratic mayor in Livingston. He was the county executive. He was viewed as the most attractive candidate. He was a real up-and-comer in the party. He was very articulate. He was very competent. And I'm proud of the fact we did not attack him or his record particularly in that 1985 race. in effect, we didn't have to, because the New Jersey economy was doing very well. The governor had a very strong record of accomplishment to run on, and the tide was with us. And the governor was a very able candidate who also did a fantastic job. So, as it turned out, we won a record victory. We won 70% to 30% in a state where there were still more registered Democrats than Republicans, as there are today.
And drove
Peter out of
Shapiro
politics.
out of politics. The person who people once said would be the first Jewish president of the United
States. Never heard from him since.
That's
He
right.
went to work at Citigroup, and I've sort of lost track of him. He's a nice guy. I don't think that was an acrimonious campaign. The governor and Peter got along. I mean, they attacked us a little bit on certain things. I remember they alleged that we hadn't cleaned up those Superfund sites fast enough, even though we'd created a state Superfund. And we did make a series of commercials where we showed, literally, click with the camera, before and after. We showed 10 different sites in rapid succession, or 5, that we had cleaned up. And we said, here's the barrels when we took office, click, here they are today, clean site. And very specifically because we had created a state Superfund to supplement the federal Superfund and get those sites cleaned up. So the one thing, Tom Kean was an early practitioner of something that Bill Clinton later talked about and became famous for, which was you don't let a charge go unanswered. You respond, and you respond quickly. And when Peter Shapiro went up in the air with ads saying we hadn't cleaned up Superfund sites, boom, 2 days later, 1 day later, we ran to New York, put these ads in the can, and we were on the air with ads saying, oh, yes, we have. And we did not let his charges go unanswered. We answered quickly, right up on the air right away, and obviously it was very effective.
Tom Kean's chief Democratic antagonist from about 1983 to 85 was Alan Karcher.
Correct.
Much
more so than
thorn.
President Arecchio or John Russo or anybody else.
Much more of a thorn in the side of Kean than Peter Shapiro or anyone.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that relationship.
Well, it was a natural role. I think Alan, as you will recall, was the Speaker of the Assembly at the time. And we did not have, in the first 2, we got him after 85, but from 82 to 85, we did not have a majority. I arrived in 82, but from 81 to 85, we did not have a majority in either house. The Democrats controlled, but it was close. And so it was his job to kind of be the opposition. I do think that Alan Karcher is a very, very bright person, very knowledgeable, and perhaps in a way that lots of people are. I mean, he's a little bit pugnacious in style anyway. I mean, he was an articulate but forceful and right on the border of confrontational guy, just as a general matter of personality. And so I do think there was an element in Speaker Karcher's view of Governor Kean that is related to what you asked about before. I think Alan Karcher fancied himself as a kind of, everyday guy from Middlesex County, representative of the working man, tough guy, ready to fight, pugnacious guy fighting for Mr. Everyday person. And he did kind of have a feeling that, well, Governor Kean's a patrician guy. He doesn't know the toughness that I've known. He's from up there in the fancy house in northern New Jersey or whatever. And, so I think he at various times tried to create that image or play that card. I don't think it ever stuck against Governor Kean, as I mentioned, because the governor is such a good person at relating to all types of people. But, a number of the initiatives that we proposed were controversial. The education package that I mentioned, the union, the NEA, it's a New Jersey affiliate, the NJ Education Association, was totally against that. They felt that if we were going to raise the minimum salaries for starting teachers by subsidizing that $5,000 difference between the $13,500 and the $18,500, that we should provide a $5,000 subsidy to every teacher up and down the food chain. Of course, led me to conclude, and others around the governor, gee, this is an education in how the unions work. Duh, surprise, that it's perhaps dominated by the more senior teachers who are a little more concerned about themselves than they are about some newly starting out teacher. But I think the people in the state understood the case, and we took the case directly to the people and were able to beat it. Same thing in the alternative certification. They really did not favor allowing somebody who hadn't gone to an education program and gotten an education certificate to teach in the New Jersey schools. And I remember there was a famous case that really crystallized the issue for us that we highlighted and used very effectively. Ed David was a very prominent research scientist who led Exxon Research and Engineering up in Florham Park, New Jersey, one of the largest research labs in the country, in the world. Not as large as Bell Labs, but very, 10,000 engineers or something working for Ed David at Exxon Research and Engineering up in Florham Park. He reached the mandatory retirement age at Exxon, 65 years old or whatever it was, retired, said he wanted to teach science in the Madison public schools. And the response was, you're not qualified. You can't teach. Now here's a guy who just run one of the world's largest science research labs, and he wasn't able to teach science in a public high school in New Jersey. And so he became the poster child for that issue. He was willing to be a student teacher for a year, take a subject matter test, and obviously he would be competent to teach. But anyway, I think to a certain extent it was Alan Karcher's job to be the opposition. I think it was his natural tendency to be a bit of a fighter. And you're right, I think we had more success on some of the very close bills, the budgets, the Transportation Trust Fund, the education package. In getting them through the Senate, it was much easier for us to kind of pick off a few Democrats to vote with us in the Senate than it was in the House. And it was a real dogfight in the Assembly on a couple of those things. A number of our initiatives, I'm sorry I can't recall, 26 years ago exactly, but there were a number of our initiatives that only passed by one vote. I think TTF was one of them.
We are taping this a day after a key figure during the Kane years passed away, Carrie Edwards.
Yeah.
How closely did you work with Carrie Edwards?
Very, very closely every day.
And how do you think people should remember Carrie Edwards?
Well, first of all, it's a sad day for New Jersey. But he was, the old phrase, the hardest working man in show business. Carrie Edwards is probably the hardest working guy ever to serve in New Jersey government. And to his credit, it's because he loved it. He had a real passion for governance, for policy, for the issues. He just loved it. And, he would have worked 100 hours a day if there were 100 hours a day in which to work. And so, he was very, very, very effective as the governor's chief counsel. That's the role. When I served in the governor's office, it was really a little triumvirate. He and I and Greg Stevens would meet all the time. And Greg was the chief of staff and was in charge of all the appointments, politics, whatever. I was kind of in charge of communications and some of the broader policy. And Carrie really was the man in terms of getting the governor's legislative package through the legislature. And he recruited and assembled an extremely able group of assistant counsels who went on themselves to successful careers. Lisa Randall, member of the Assembly and Senate, and Jane Kelly, who's the number 2 person at the New Jersey School Construction Finance Authority, or whatever it's called. Todd Caliguire, who later ran for freeholder and then for governor himself, and so on and so. Wayne Hasselbalg, who's now the chief of policy for Governor Christie. He assembled a great team. Sue Marinucci, daughter of the Matalucci. Sue Matalucci, daughter of Phil Matalucci, who was the Cape May County Republican chairman and a legendary Republican, wonderful, funny guy, famous for wearing big elephant hats at the Republican national conventions. But he had a great team, and they were very competent, very, very hardworking. And Carrie would just meet with them endlessly all day and be down in the legislature and work in this vote, work in that vote. Voracious appetite for data, detail, could read hundreds of pages of memos every day, even write hundreds of pages of memos every day. And then, when everybody else was finished working, he and his group would leave about 8 o'clock every night, and they would decamp to the Princeton Diner up on Route 1 in Princeton. And Carrie would go and kind of hold court at the same table every night, and every assistant counsel would go. And they'd all sit around, 8 of them, and talk policy for 4 more hours till midnight or whatever. And every now and then, an outsider, I wasn't one of the assistant counsels, I wasn't a lawyer, but you'd be invited for like an audience to that group, and you could go and have your own sandwich and cup of coffee and they wanted to pick your brain on some issue or another or get you educated on some issue or another. But Kerry was a great, great, great servant to the people, to the state of New Jersey. Worked incredibly hard in every job he ever had. After I left and went to the White House in the governor's second term, of course, he became the Attorney General and served with distinction in that role too, and of course ran himself for governor. I noticed in the New York Star-Ledger today there was a quote from Governor Kane, who said it's a shame that the people were, denied the opportunity to have Kerry serve, because he would have been a great governor.
Ran twice, 89 and 93.
93, and he had encyclopedic. Obviously he didn't win the primary, and other candidates were more successful than he was. But I will tell you this: I can guarantee there was nobody in either of those races whose knowledge of New Jersey government was more encyclopedic than Kerry's. He knew everything about every issue, every law, every statute, and had an idea for what should be done next. And really just a voracious appetite for policy and for good policy ideas. And a charming, wonderful guy.
You left in 86.
I did.
Under what circumstances?
I received a call. I was sitting at home in Princeton on a Monday night in late 1985, after our election. Probably would have been late November, early December. I remember it was a Monday night. I was watching Monday Night Football. And it was the White House operator. And I actually thought it was a joke. I thought it was, because there had been some stories in the newspaper that perhaps I might go to the White House. That Governor Kane had attracted national attention, had been quite successful. There'd been a story, Michael Wines wrote a profile of me in the New York Times in that era, highlighting how the governor had communicated successfully and
Carl
so on.
Golden let that one.
I guess he let that one go. And I got a call, and I'm sitting on my couch, and it was the White House operator. And I thought it was Todd Caliguire, my friend and assistant counsel to the governor and acolyte of Kerry Edwards, playing a joke on me and impersonating the White House operator. I said, "Mr. Grady, this is the White House operator. George Bush would like to talk to you." And I was like, "Yeah, right, screw you." And as I was saying that, the voice said, "Bob, George Bush here." And it was George H.W. Bush, then the Vice President of the United States. And he said to me, "Bob, we've watched what you did for Tommy Kane up there in New Jersey." He called him Tommy Kane, which I'm sure drove the governor crazy. He said, "I watched what you did for Tommy Kane up there in New Jersey, and obviously I'm getting ready for my own campaign. I'd like you to do the same thing for me, the same exact job, fix my communications, etc." And I was still pretty young. I was 27 at this point, and I had watched people in politics over the years and said, gee, it may not be the worst thing to get a graduate degree. And both Governor Kane and Mrs. Fenwick always gave me advice and always said, you need to have another career and other options. That way you can leave, the way Mrs. Fenwick used to phrase it, that way you can leave politics, when you want, when you have to, or when you should. And so I had applied to business school, had gotten into Harvard and Stanford business schools, had kind of decided in my head to go to Stanford Business School. And in fact, had told Governor Kane that was the direction I was heading, because he had wanted me to be the chief of staff in the second term. And I said, no, I think it's the right time to go get an MBA. And George Bush, I said, and he said, well, why don't you, most people like to work in the White House, why don't you come down and see how you like it? And he had Bob Teeter subsequently call me, his pollster, and Nick Brady, who was his very close friend, who later was served as Secretary of the Treasury under President Bush, call me and say, gee, you ought to take this job. So I went down and worked for that year, 1986, there. But I did go to Stanford Business School. I left after a little bit, having been his speechwriter. While I was in business school, I actually wrote speeches on contract for Vice President Bush and other candidates around the country. Ed Schau and others ran for Senate in California back then. And I actually was hired by them to watch debates and come up with one-liners to say back to the other guy in the presidential debates in the primaries for the 88 race. Such that I went through business school, and on the very last day of my class, I took a red eye and left California and went back to Washington and walked in the next morning. Lee Atwater and Mary Madeline said, Grady, where you been? And they didn't even realize, I think I'd been kind of not there for the last year and a half. I'd been writing stuff from a distance. But I walked in and was, the head speechwriter on the 1988 Bush presidential campaign, which I always point out is the one that we won. That was a great job and a lot of fun. And actually, it was fun because I got to interact with Governor Kaine again. We came to New Jersey many, many times, did a number of events here. Bill Palatucci was our statewide campaign manager, and Bill had been the Tom Kaine campaign manager in 1985, so we were very, very close. And that year, in part, after checking with me as a kind of recommender, we tapped Governor Kaine to be the keynote speaker at the 1988 Republican National Convention in New Orleans, and he did a great job, gave a great speech. Had a big hourglass the size of 3 feet high, and he turned it over and said, "Time is running out on the Democrats." That was his prop. But he gave a great speech, and the governor was very popular after that, his big win in '85, and well known around the country. And in fact, there was a little period there when I was involved because my job was the head speechwriter and the sort of senior policy advisor, and I worked most closely with Bob Teeter, who was the key strategist and pollster for the campaign, and Bob Zellick, who was kind of the issues director, and he and I shared an office, and Bob today is the president of the World Bank and has remained a very close friend ever since. And Teeter ran a little process to decide who should be the vice presidential candidate. And Tom Kaine was on that list, and I was interviewed for due diligence purposes about everything I knew about Tom Kaine. Was he a good guy? Was he easy to work with? Blah, 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 blah. I think at the end, President Bush decided not to choose Governor Kaine because his own upbringing might be regarded as patrician, and he was from Greenwich, and that was a charge people could be expected to make, and he felt Bush and Kaine would be perhaps too much of that. I remember we looked at Governor Thompson of Illinois. Jim Thompson was then a very successful two-term governor of Illinois. We looked at Senator Danforth briefly. He didn't really make the list. I can tell you, though, in the 4 people, Dan Quayle wasn't on that list. I think Teeter and Roger Ailes both knew Senator Quayle because they had worked on he won in 1980, beating Birch Bayh in the Reagan landslide, and then he was reelected in '86, and I think both Teeter and Ailes worked on his '86 campaign. So anyway, the surprise pick, of course, in New Orleans was Vice President Quayle, and I went on and became great friends with the Vice President. In fact, I just was in Phoenix, in Scottsdale this spring, and I stayed at his house with he and Marilyn, and we had dinner and played golf. And I went to a fundraiser for his son Ben Quayle, won the Republican primary to represent Scottsdale in the U.S. Congress, and is the likely winner of that House seat, which will be decided in 2 weeks here.
We're almost out of time.
Okay.
What else have you done since then?
So my career after Governor Kaine's office, I was a speechwriter for the vice president for that year. Then I went to business school at Stanford, worked a little bit on Wall Street. Then I ran the speechwriting on the '88 campaign, and when we won, I served all 4 years in the White House for George H.W. Bush, first as the Associate Director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, for Natural Resources, Energy, and Science, which is, OMB is kind of the policy arm of the White House, and they oversee not only the budget, but all policy development. So an agency of the federal government can't send a bill to Capitol Hill, can't testify on Capitol Hill, anything, unless OMB clears it. So it's kind of a powerful job. It was a lot of fun. And my kind of portfolio was all the environmental issues, EPA, DOE, all the R&D science issues. So I had oversight over NASA, over the National Science Foundation, and the research agencies of the federal government. And then, agriculture and natural resources, public lands, et cetera. And then in 1991, President Bush nominated me to be the deputy director of OMB. And then in 1992, when he was running for president, they wanted me to be freed up to also help with speechwriting and campaign and debate prep. And so I became deputy assistant to the president and the number 2 at OMB. We called it executive associate director at OMB. So I did that. Then in 1992, we lost. As I used to say when I met other people in my next job, I said, well, I was fired from my last job by millions of people acting in concert. But I decided that the right thing to do, having gone to business school, when you lose a national election, is get out of Dodge and just go do something different. I had a very clear view and conscious strategy that I did not want to be a lobbyist or a Washington type. And so I left Washington and I moved to Silicon Valley, to California, became an investment banker, ultimately a partner, and ultimately on the management committee of a high technology investment banking firm called Robertson Stevens and Company, which was the #1 underwriter of technology IPOs in the 1990s. Great time to be in Silicon Valley. was wonderful. We had much success, and we actually sold the firm in the late 90s to the Bank of America. We actually bought it back from Bank of America, then sold it to Bank Boston. And Bank Boston was bought by Fleet, which itself was bought by Bank of America. So we had a series of transactions which were all good for the partners of Robertson Stephens. And then in 2000, I left Robertson Stephens and became a partner at the Carlyle Group, which is one of the world's largest private equity firms. And I was a partner there for 10 years, served on the management committee there, ran their global venture capital practice, investing in high growth, high technology companies in the United States and all around the world. And then just last year retired from there and founded my own fund with two other guys called Cheyenne Capital Fund. And all through that period have remained very active in public life and in politics. So have had the occasion to be asked to help various politicians over the years. So I used to write and edit Pete Wilson, Governor Pete Wilson of California's State of the States and budget messages for him. When Governor Schwarzenegger ran for office, I was one of the key advisors in his recall election in 2003, chaired a group that wrote all of his environmental policies, et cetera, and then was a member of Arnold's transition team. California was actually offered the job of chief of staff to Governor Schwarzenegger, but I was having fun being in the finance business and decided not to do it. I was co-chairman of the George W. Bush for President campaign in both 2000 and 2004 in California. Did a lot of surrogate speaking and television for him. And since I've moved to Wyoming, have remained active there. I'm the finance chairman of the Republican Party there. I give a lot of speeches around Wyoming, very active in Wyoming politics. And in the last 2 years, my good friend from childhood, Chris Christie, ran for governor of New Jersey. So I helped prepare him a bit in the debates in the last year's cycle. And then when he won the governorship, he asked me, and I agreed to be the co-chairman of his sort of emergency transition task force on budget and taxes, which is really the number one problem or issue he faced coming in. And Rich Bagger, now the chief of staff to the governor, and I co-chaired a transition committee developing budget plans to get ready for when he took office. And since he's been in office, I've been an informal advisor to him. I ended up helping him draft his inaugural address and his speeches to the joint session of the New Jersey legislature on the budget and on the property tax issue. And he asked me, and I agreed to be the chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors, which I do for compensation of zero because I live in Wyoming. I commute to here for that. And then asked me to serve on the New Jersey State Investment Council, which oversees the state's $68 billion pension plan. And I was elected chairman of that body, so I'm chairman of the State Investment Council as well, which fits, I've been the last 18 years in the investment business. And so I'm chairing that. So I remain extremely active in public life. I have a private equity fund, a $360 million private equity fund that I run with two other fellows. And I'm on the board of directors of a number of companies, 2 or 3 public companies and 4 private companies, mostly in technology, a semiconductor company, an investment bank, a IT services company, and so on. It's an online travel company. So very active and enjoying life, but grateful for the time to have served for Governor Kane. I think he is, he was not only a very effective governor and a very nice person, but a great leader for the state. I think history will recognize him for what he was, which is one of the most effective leaders the state ever had.